Hey folks, welcome back to the Edupedia world, and we are discussing the standards in auditing, and I am Abhinay Gupta. So the basic standard under consideration for today's lecture would be SA 610, which is using the work of internal auditor. You know, the entire 600 series, you have three standards in the 600 series: 600, 610 and 620, right? And all these three deals with you as an auditor, as a statutory auditor, dealing with the work of somebody else. 600 deals with the work of other auditor. Other auditor means the auditor of some other component, maybe a branch, a subsidiary or something like that. 610, it deals with using the work of an internal auditor, right, who is a part of the company now. And third is using the work of an audit expert, right, and which is very much different than the management expert that we have earlier seen, right? So basically 600 series contains only these three standards on auditing, right? And today we are dealing one of them, which is using the work of internal auditor. Okay, so we'll see who the internal auditor are, how to use the work, what is the scope, what is the objective, what are the requirements, and the same consistent flow that we have been following in all the standards, right? Because there are specific things you need to remember, the specific thing, the specific pattern based on which the standard is drafted actually, right? So the first thing that we will understand in this standard is the definition, right? The standard provides two definition. Again, when the standard provides the definition, it helps you. You know why? We have discussed it earlier. Just because if you quote that definition, you do not need to explain that term again. Otherwise, you take one or two paragraphs explaining the terms. Like we had seen the example in the SA 580, the written representation. Correct? Now, the first definition that the standard SA 610 using the work of internal auditors define is the internal audit function. Now, what is an internal audit function? And who is an internal auditor? These are the two definitions provided by this standard. So when we talk about the internal audit function, I would read out the definition. An appraisal activity established or provided as a service to the entity. Its function include, amongst other things, examining, evaluating and monitoring the adequacy and effectiveness of internal control. So the prime thing that you need to understand when you talk about the internal audit function is that it is basically incorporated into your company, into your client. Like you are the auditor, you don't have a company, you have a firm. Into the client, your client, that's a company, right? It is incorporated into that company by its management, basically with regards to the internal control of the company, right? When we say that it is an appraisal activity established or provided as a service to the entity, it means that internal audit function is a separate function which is attached to the entity, right? These are the activities which are established or which are provided to the entity as a service, means somebody else provides it. That does not mean that internal auditor cannot be an employee. He can also be an employee, but when he works as an internal auditor, it is a separate capacity, right? If being an employee is one capacity and being an internal auditor is a separate capacity of the same employee. That is why we call it a service that is provided to the entity by the internal auditor and not the employee at that point of time, although he is an employee. And they can be external internal auditors employed by the management. External, it can be an entire firm, an internal audit firm, where you have 2-3 members sitting in your office throughout the year and then working on some internal control functions. They check the internal control, right? You are performing the entire task. Your client, I'm talking about your client. When I refer to you, presume I'm talking about the client when I am talking about this function. And in general, when I'm talking about you, is the auditor, the statutory auditor, right? So as an entity, as a client, what you are supposed to do is that you have to employ the internal audit function, deploy the internal audit function in your day-to-day functioning. When you get into the transactions, you get into the activities, the events that occur into your company, right? They need to be checked. The internal control that are applicable, that have been designed, implemented and maintained by the management, they need to be checked whether or not those internal control functions are working properly, working appropriately, right? Whether or not they are able to solve the purpose for which they were designed, right? So it says its function include, amongst other things, examining, evaluating and monitoring the adequacy and effectiveness of internal control. You will examine means you see whether the internal control functions, they are working properly, whether they have been implemented on the proper appropriate places, and then you will evaluate what are they doing, what is it providing you with, right? And then you have to monitor whether is it going fair throughout your period under concern, the entire financial year to say, right? And by doing that, what do you judge? You judge the adequacy and you judge the effectiveness of that internal control, whether or not it is adequate. Do you need to amend it? Do you need to change it? Do you need to replace it completely? That is when you check the adequacy. And effectiveness is how well is it able to perform the controls for which it has been designed. So that is the definition of internal audit function. Next we talk about internal auditors. So what does the definition say? It says those individuals who perform the activities of the internal audit function, right? And the internal auditors may belong to an internal audit department or equivalent function. That means you do not necessarily need to have an internal audit department, right? When we talk about an employee being an internal auditor, if he has that potential, if he has that capacity, you define him that okay, he is having certain specified qualification, the capacity, he is competent, he is capable. You will define his objectivity and then you'll say he is an internal auditor for us. So anybody who is performing the above activity that we have discussed is an internal auditor, right? So he necessarily does not need to be a chartered accountant, because he is not giving the company any attest function over there. He is not delivering any report, auditor's report, right? That is why it is not a compulsion, and hence when you are using his work, you need to check his competence. What is his qualification? What are the standards that he follows, right? For internal auditors, you have a separate set of standards. These are not the standards that the internal auditors they follow. These standards are specifically designed and formulated. They have been drafted specifically for the purpose of assisting the statutory auditor and not the internal auditor. For internal auditor, you have separate standards. So that was about the definition part. Now we move ahead to the scope and objective of the internal audit function. Since we have defined the internal audit function, first we'll see the scope and objective of the internal audit function. This is not the scope and objective of the standard. Understand the difference. We are not here talking about the scope and objective of SA 610. Why? Because what is the name of SA 610? It says using the work of internal auditors. That means it gives you the parameters, it gives you the considerations that you need to follow when you are using the work of an internal auditor. And who are you? You are the statutory auditor, an external auditor to the company, right? But over here on the slide, we are talking about the scope and objective of the internal audit function. So this is a separate thing that we are talking. Since the Act defined the internal audit function, so we are talking about their scope and objective. And why are we talking about it? Why is that important? Because this will help you to evaluate whether that internal auditor's work is relevant or not for your audit. Because that is now the main objective. So these objectives are actually provided and they need to be complied in order to meet the main objective of the standard. Clear with that part? Now, we'll see what are the scope and objective of the internal audit function. So the first consideration in scope and objective of the internal audit function is the monitoring of the internal control. Yes, we are talking about the internal control established by the management, right? But before moving on to that, you need to understand something. So basically what you need to understand is that the objectives of the internal audit function, that varies from client to client, from industry to industry, from company to company, right? Because an internal control Why? The internal audit function, basically, if you have seen over there, as per the definition, it depends on the internal control, and your internal control will basically depend upon the size and structure of the entity. Right? If you are into a highly regulated entity, your internal control has to be very strong. I'm giving an example. If you are into a bank, your internal control has to be very strong. But if you are a normal manufacturing entity, your internal control need not be that strong. You need not apply a hell lot of controls over there. Minute controls for the administrative part, if you apply controls on the procurement, on the sales, on the production, on the stock, those things are enough for you, right? But when you talk about the bank, right, it is a very critical company. You have money of lots and lots of investors involved, saving account, demat account, and lot of things involved in the bank. So you cannot risk even 1% losing any data, any track. So your internal control in the banking sector, I'm taking an example, right? It is just an example. So your internal control in the banking sector is very, very important. I'm just taking an example that your internal control in the banking sector is very, very important, right? So what kinds of internal control you apply and what will the internal auditor do with that internal control will always depend upon the size and the structure of the entity, the nature of the entity, right? And along with that, it is not compulsory that all manufacturing units will have the same kind of internal control. No, it will always depend on what the management requires. If I'm talking about the internal control function, internal audit function, then that function will always depend upon the requirement of the management. And if there is a specifically dedicated those charged with governance, then those charged with governance. So these are the factors on which your internal audit function will always depend. So when we're talking about the activities of the internal audit function, then that may include the monitoring of internal control, where you have been assigned a responsibility. By whom? By the management of the company or those charged with governance, right? And what is that responsibility? That you are supposed to monitor the internal control. You are supposed to review the controls that have been implemented by that management, whether or not they are able to achieve the objective, whether or not they are able to achieve the targets for which they have been prepared, right? That is your aspect, that is what you have to review. And then whether or not they are functional throughout the period consistently, that is what you have to monitor. The operations of the management is what you have to monitor, right? And then if you feel that yes, there is a need of an improvement, or there is something specific that you need to add on, or there's a change that you need to make, you will inform the management, and then management will undertake your consultation, your consideration, will reconsider on the fact, and then decide whether or not they actually need to do, right? And you know, very interesting part, that when you make a recommendation to the management as an internal auditor, right, how much weightage is the management giving to your words, to your recommendations, is very important for the external auditor, because that will help him judge your importance in the company. That will help him judge your independence in the company, right? If the management does not take in your considerations, and if you are dominated by the management, then the external auditor, we as a statutory auditor, we will not want to use your work for our audit. Because we are not sure, we know if even if you have found out something, the management could have dominated you and you could not perform. So placing reliance on your work will become actually very difficult for an external auditor, right? So if they're taking your recommendation and then improving their controls accordingly, then that is a very good thing, right? And that is something that the statutory auditor will also appreciate for the internal auditor. Next activity that an internal audit function needs to perform is the examination of the financial and operating information. So how do you basically examine the financial and operating information? What are the financial information? These are those transactions, those events that have occurred, that you have recorded, that you are using for preparing the financial statements. So you are basically assigned a task whereby you need to review how has the management identified those transactions, identified the events that have occurred. What is the basis of identification? When do you recognize it, right? How do you measure it? What is the basis of measurement? What is the calculation that you make, right? How do you classify it? Revenue, capital, what kind of an expenditure is it, right? Whether it is an asset, whether it is a liability, whether it is a contingent liability, whether it is a provision, whether it will be shown as a footnote or whether it will be displayed in the balance sheet, how do you recognize it? How do you classify it? Right? And finally, how do you report it? So these things have to be reviewed by the internal auditor. Right? That is an internal audit function. And for that, you may also need to get into the detailed checking of the transaction. Okay, the transaction occurred, show me the invoices. I want to see from where did the transaction initiate? Was it authorized? Okay, it went over there. What was the next step? Did you receive the sales order? Did you receive the amount? You have made the sales. Did you check the delivery? Where about the POD, proof of deliveries? These things you will check and you'll see whether the transaction has actually originated, whether the internal control functions that have been applied for the transactions are working appropriately. Right? Then what is the final balance of the entire ledger? You have to check it. Even the casting, totaling, you'll have to do all those things. Right? And what is the procedure actually performed for the recording of the transactions? So you have to perform a detailed examination of the financial and the operating information that you have. Right? And financial information are actually the core. You as a statutory auditor is also very much to a large extent, a major portion of your audit would cover the examination of the financial data. Right? And the internal auditor also has the task of first, like before you come in, they have the task of analyzing and reviewing and examining the financial data. Right? So when you see that yes, there is an internal auditor present in the company, you are still a little comforted that okay, the chances of errors have been reduced. There's a second level of checking, a second level of filter that the financial statements have gone through before it reached you as a statutory auditor. Right? The next activity is the review of operating activities. So what you need to understand is, as an external auditor, I am basically concerned with the financial data, right? But as an internal auditor, your work area is even larger. That is why you are present throughout the country over there. You have to see the functioning of the entire company. So even the operating activities, which may not be financial, which may be non-financial activities, have also to be taken under consideration by the internal auditor in its internal audit function. You will have to judge whether the operations, the activities that you're performing are efficient. When I'm talking about efficient, cost efficiency, production efficiency, time efficiency, labor efficiency, all these efficiencies you will have to check. And whether your acts are finally effective, whether you are getting output out of it, whether you have something productive in your hand. Right? So even reviewing those things are covered under the scope of the internal audit function. Right? Next is the review of compliance with law and regulation. That is very important with any entity, and it becomes specifically important when you deal with any entity that is highly regulated. When we talk about an insurance company, a banking sector, right, all these type of things over there, they are highly regulated. IRDA, Insurance Act, SEBI, RBI, all these legal regulatory bodies, they are punching it from behind. This, these are the benchmarks, these are the deadlines, these are the procedures, these are the tasks, these are the forms to be filled up, these are the limits and everything. Everything is defined. If you go to the bank, you have the cash reserve ratio, you have the ratio of the reserve as per section 18 and all of things. Even if you're a normal client and you're dealing with the foreign currencies, right, then also you have to follow the provisions of FEMA, Foreign Exchange Management Act. So where all these specific regulatory bodies are acting upon your entity, at that point of time, your review of the compliance with the law and regulation is very important. And you may do that with the management's directives. You will see what are the other applicable regulations, the laws which are applicable on the entity, and whether or not they're performing it. Although the prime responsibility of recognizing these things depends upon is vested upon the secretary, right, which is the company secretary we're talking about. But then even it is your responsibility to check whether the application of that company secretary is appropriate. Right? Next activity is the risk management. So when we talk about the risk management, you have to be focused on reducing the risk. When I say you in this parlance, I'm talking about the internal auditor. Right? He has to be very much specific and very efficient to reduce the risk to the minimum acceptable level. Obviously, there is a concept of residual risk. Risk cannot be minimized to zero, right? So what is the residual risk? Is the acceptable level of risk that the entity encourages that, okay, if it is at this level, I accept it, because you cannot have zero risk, right? So it is the internal auditor's responsibility to manage that risk. And when you have to manage the risk, first and foremost thing that is required out of you is to identify and evaluate what is the exposure to risk. If you have a high exposure to risk or a low exposure to risk, accordingly you have to see what controls have to be applied so that you can contribute to the improvement in the risk management. You can contribute to the reduction of the risk, right? So how you manage risk will also be an important integral part of the internal auditor's function, right? And at last you have the governance. So when we talk about governance, it actually encompasses the entire other functions. When you talk about governance, you are dealing with the entire functioning of your client. Whether or not your client is meeting the performance objectives, the other objectives that it has designed, whether or not the communication throughout the hierarchy is proper, communication even outside the entity with the auditors, the external auditors, among the management, those charged with governance, are those communications strong? Is there a good flow of communication? Are you able to achieve the objectives that you had set, maybe for ethics, maybe for values, right? You have certain performance objectives. Are they met? Is the governance process working efficiently towards that? Are you able to manage the risk? Are you able to communicate the risk if you have anticipated any of them? These are the areas that would encompass the entire governance, and watching the proper accomplishment or a good flow of the governance process is the task of the internal audit function, right? So these are the 6 basic activities that the internal audit function undertakes. Monitoring the internal control, that is the prime thing. When we talk about internal auditor, internal control is always attached to it, right? Now since we are dealing with the audit, so financial and operating informations are also very important, right? So when we're talking about operating information, they are the outcome of the operating activities, so you have to review the operating activities, right? And when you're into an operation, your company is into an operation, you have to see whether you're meeting the conditions and the criteria of the laws and regulations around. Is there a risk involved in it? If it is, then how do you manage the risk? And finally, how is the entire governance process working, right? That was about the scope and objective of the internal audit function. So that was a brief introduction to this chapter when we talk about the internal auditor, right? The standard, the name of the standard is using the work of an internal auditors. So far we have seen the work of the internal auditors. We have yet not come to the process of using it. That means, what does this standard say about this internal audit function to the statutory auditor? Because the standard is not designed for the internal audit function. This standard is actually designed to support the statutory auditor, and we have not yet dealt with any such situation, right? But since now with this explanation, I hope you are clear with the internal audit function, right? Now the entire idea, the entire concept of the internal audit is clear with you. This will help you to form a base for the actual standard. So we will break the class, we'll break the lecture over here today, and the remaining part that deals with the actual requirement of the standard, the actual objective of this standard, will be taken up in the next lecture. So until then, please stay tuned, because we have not yet been to the actual standard, right? So we'll take it up in the next lecture. Until then, this is Abhinay Gupta signing off.